whether or not the ELCA does advocacy. And a few of us said yes right away. So I have examples. And I'll pass them around. Don't read these, just look them over. The top one is a letter from the presiding bishop of the ELCA to Mike Pompeo, and some of the others are announcements to the news. Just look them over. If you would like to know more about this, have this. I have a pad of paper back there, and put your name on it and your email address. I will send the links to this to you if you want it, and then you can do what you want. You can sign up on the ELCA website and get this stuff on your own. So anyway, that's it. In the brochure, in the bulletin this morning was a notice about Augusta Victoria Hospital. Funding has been cut, and it's a desperate situation. That's advocacy. Augusta Victoria is a Lutheran World Federation hospital in East Jerusalem, a very important institution. The Lutheran, I'm sure nobody gets it anymore, except me, I guess. I don't know. Living Lutheran has an article on Augusta Victoria. So there's lots of advocacy. That's what I'm saying. So I'll just look this over, pass it around. And then, if you want, I'll send those things to you.
Okay, thank you, Sonia.
That's all.
By way of introduction, and I hope you all got the handout that was on the table over there. By way of introduction, I just wanted to introduce you to the resolution that the ELCA adopted back in August of 2013. They adopted a social policy resolution titled Voting Rights to All Citizens. This resolution calls on members, congregations, and synods of the church to, and this is a quotation from them, promote public life worthy of the name by speaking out as an advocate and engaging in local efforts such as voter registration and supporting legislation to guarantee the right to vote to all citizens. We are called to conversation and prayer around our role as U.S. residents and people of faith in ensuring our election systems, guaranteeing participation, and promote dignity for all. This is taken right off the ELCA website dealing with promote the vote. So you can see that the church, the local synod as well as the ELCA church itself is very, very conscious about the need to promote the vote. All right, I'm not going to say any more about that because we have a wonderful presentation here. Professor Eli Savit is going to come up and talk about the current effort to enhance voter registration and make voting access to the voting booth easier for people here in Michigan. Professor Savit.
Thank you. So my name is Eli Savit. I'm an adjunct professor at the law school, and I appreciate the honorific. My day job is I serve as Mayor Duggan's senior advisor and general counsel in Detroit, but I'm not here in that capacity. I'm just here to try to get some information out about what is going to be on the ballot in November as Proposal 3, which, as Ron says, really is geared towards increasing access to the ballot. So what I want to do is I want to sort of just start off by saying a little bit about where we are, where we are here in the state of Michigan. In Michigan, 2.8 million people did not cast a ballot that were eligible to vote in the 2016 presidential election. That's part of 92 million Americans that were eligible to vote that didn't do so nationwide. And where we come at this from Promote the Vote, from Proposal 3, we fundamentally believe that democracy is stronger when we reduce barriers to voting and we make sure that everybody that wants to have the opportunity to cast that ballot can do so. Unfortunately, here in Michigan, there are a lot of really unnecessary barriers to the ballot box. A federal judge recently said that Michigan has the most restrictive voting regime in the country in terms of the rules that we have around registration, around voting, and the way that we actually administer our elections. Now, I grew up here. I'm a native Michigander, and I assume a lot of you guys are too. And that kind of hurts, because the truth of the matter is we actually, as a state, used to be an innovator and a leader in promoting access to the ballot. We were the very first state in the United States that passed what's called a motor voter law, which allows people to register to vote when they're getting their driver's license or their photo ID at the Secretary of State's office. We did that back in 1974, and in 1998 that became a national requirement. So we were really an innovator there. We were the first state to actually have a statewide voter registration system back in the 1970s too. Before that, if you were registered to vote in Ann Arbor and you moved out to Ypsilanti or Detroit or something like that, you had your paper trail didn't follow you, and it led to a bunch of chaos and people being disenfranchised. And we took the step to say, no, we're going to consolidate this. We're going to have a statewide voter registration system. Again, we were the first to do that, and nationally that followed in 1998 as well. So it's really sad to see how far behind Michigan has fallen, given our actually illustrious history in being a leader in voting rights. And this is one aspect of this. This is where we are today. You see the states that are shaded red there, most of the country. These are states that allow citizens to register to vote within 30 days of the election. Michigan is one of only 12 states that still has what's frankly a pretty antiquated requirement, which requires registration, a month or more out. So we're in basically the bottom fourth or quarter of the United States in that regard. And by the way, you just know these are not. You see the election maps every election day, and it's a red and blue America or whatever. This is pretty bipartisan, right? You look at these states across the country. These are Republican-controlled states. These are Democratic-controlled states. This isn't really a partisan issue. It's just a good governance issue. Similarly, here we have the states that are shaded in blue are states that allow voters to cast a ballot prior to election day, that allow either no reason absentee voting or have early voting. This is, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but this is important for working people. A lot of people don't get paid time off to go to the polls and vote. If you're working a long shift, let's say you're a working mom, it's tough to find time during the day sometimes on a random Tuesday in November to actually show up at the polls and to cast a ballot. Unfortunately in Michigan, like again, the vast majority in other states, we don't allow people that are facing those types of challenges to cast an early vote. You can cast an absentee ballot, but you can only do it if you have one of several specified reasons. If you're disabled, if you're over the age of 65, if you're in jail, or if you're expected to be away from your community for the entire day on election day. So being a single mom that's taking care of sick kids and working 2 jobs, that doesn't count. Somebody being a student that may have to travel back to their community, that doesn't count, right? So it's only those specified reasons that allow you to cast a vote early. And again, we're in the distinct minority among states there. And I mentioned this sort of illustrious history that the state of Michigan has with voter reform, but all that was back in the 1970s. We are one of only 2 states that since that time has not passed any real election reforms to increase access to the ballot box. It's us and it's Mississippi. Meanwhile, 36 states and the District of Columbia, they've passed 3 or more reforms. So we have really been lapped, not just once over, not just twice over, but 3 times over by voting reforms that have happened in other states. And it's to the detriment of citizens that have to, now face these barriers to just participate in our democracy. I'm not going to talk too much about this today, but there's another aspect too. There's reports of Russian interference in election, and people, both foreign and domestic, have tried to hack ballot systems in 21 states. That's this is the assessment of intelligence officers and the FBI. We got a C in protecting election security, and one of the things that we don't do, we don't have a mandatory post-election audit, which means that an audit would require a representative sample of the ballots, because we do have paper ballots in Michigan, and for somebody to look over them to make sure that everything is on the up and up. We do allow the Secretary of State to do a permissive audit after the election, but as you can imagine, and you see this post-2016, that all gets bogged down in partisanship, right? It's often the loser that wants the audit, and the winner wants to say, no, there was no interference, everything's on the up and up. So our failure to require a post-election audit is what gives us this low score. And it decreases the confidence that people have in the elections, and there's no evidence that Michigan's elections were ever hacked or that the security was ever compromised, but it leaves us potentially vulnerable, and it leaves us vulnerable not just to an attack, but to not detecting an attack as well. So, I give these presentations, they got all these people on the website, and you can hear about like real people's stories and how this has effectively disenfranchised them. But the story that I like to tell is actually one of my coworkers. So my coworker in the city of Detroit, his name's Ryan Friedrichsen. He is our director of development, and he is a military veteran. He served in the Afghanistan conflict. And when he was stationed abroad in Afghanistan, he requested his absentee ballot, because that's one of the reasons that you can get an absentee ballot in Michigan is if you're serving abroad. And he requested it, well ahead of time, very politically engaged, really wanted to vote. And the ballot wasn't mailed until just like a week or two before the election. And the mail system in Afghanistan, I gather, is not the best in the world. And he got it after the election. So he was effectively disenfranchised by our inability to effectively administer elections. And that's somebody that's overseas, that's serving our country, that has stepped up. If anybody is going to be able to vote, we need to protect the votes of veterans. And despite him doing every single thing right, his vote did not count in that election. And there's dozens of other people that are on the Promote the Vote website if you want to check it out. Single moms who have been unable to vote because they couldn't make time on election day. People whose registration was sort of mixed up in the process and weren't able to re-register in their residence on election day because we have this 30-day requirement. But these are real people that are trying to participate in our democracy and are being effectively disenfranchised just by bad governance, not by any sort of partisan malice, but just by bad governance. So, Proposal 3, it'll be on the ballot this November. Proposal 1 or 2 are different things, so it's the third one. There's 3 proposals, and we're talking about the Proposal 3. This is going to be a constitutional amendment that seeks to increase the franchise by really removing some of these bureaucratic obstacles and make it easier for people to vote. This is again a nonpartisan endeavor. It is backed by a wide variety of groups, including the ACLU, the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, Michigan League for Public Policy, but it's not being pushed by any particular party, and it really is just about good governance. And I'm going to walk through each of these in a little bit more detail, but there's about 7 things it would do. A, it would protect the secrecy of the ballot. It would constitutionalize the secret ballot. It would fix the problem that I identified earlier with my friend that didn't get his ballot overseas, and make absolutely sure that our military forces serving overseas get their absentee ballot in time. It will give voters the option to vote straight party. That's been in the news a lot recently. This is the first year in 127 years we're not going to have that option, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. It will automatically register citizens unless they opt out. It would allow citizens to register up to and including Election Day. This is a reform that has been implemented in a number of different states with great success. It would allow no reason absentee voting, which is effectively just early voting. And it would require an audit, a mandatory audit after each election, so we can make sure that we're catching anything that's going wrong. So first thing, secret ballot. How many people in here think that there's a constitutional requirement to a secret ballot? Yeah, I guess there's not because I'm up here talking about it. So I sort of gave away the answer. But when I talk about this, people are usually very surprised because we have this idea growing up. We learn about it in our civics class that we have the right to a secret ballot, and you sort of think oh, that's probably somewhere in the U.S. Constitution. It's not. There's no federal requirement that you be able to cast a secret ballot. If a state wants to do it, a state can have you all go to one room and raise your hand and say exactly who you're voting for. And in Michigan, we don't do that. We do have functionally a secret ballot, but it's not in the Constitution. It can be changed at any time by the legislature. If the legislature wants to say that you have to publicly cast your ballot for the candidate of your choice, they can do that. So the first thing we're doing is this is just common sense. If you want to keep your vote secret, you should be able to do it. So we want to constitutionalize the right to a secret ballot in Michigan, like it is in 39 other states, and make sure that no mischief can happen around that with the legislature in future years. The second thing, military and overseas voters. If you look at this number, 77% of the military and overseas ballots that were transmitted by Michigan in 2016 were counted. So, okay. It means 23% of them weren't. And when we said 23% of the ballots that were sent over to service members, and by the way, they requested it, so they requested it with an intention to vote. So it's not like we're just spamming service members with absentee ballots. They ultimately weren't counted. And part of the reason why is our administration is just haphazard around this, and we don't mail them out with sufficient time to get them overseas, to get them to active combat zones, and to make sure we're able to get them back. So what Promote the Vote would do was it would require the Secretary of State to send out at least 45 days ahead of time absentee ballots to overseas voters and to members of the military that are serving abroad, to make sure they have plenty of time for the ballot to get there, plenty of time to get it back, and that it can actually be counted on election day. Third thing, straight party voting. We have had straight party voting in Michigan. Straight party voting just means that, many of you have probably seen this, you go into the ballot box, if you know which party you want to vote for the entire slate of partisan candidates, you can just fill in the box, Democrat, Republican, theoretically, Libertarian, Natural Law Party, whatever, and your vote will count for each of those candidates that have been nominated by that party. We've had this option in Michigan since 1891. For 127 years, we've had it. It's an option that, frankly, is used by members of both parties. In Wayne County in Detroit, it's something like 63% of people in some precincts, particularly in Detroit, vote straight party Democratic. But in Ottawa County, up in northern Michigan, it's a similar percentage that use it to vote Republican. And the reason people do this is because, ballots are complicated. We got long lines already. You're trying to get in, get out, get back to your job. If you know what to do, there's no reason you should have to go down the ballot and fill in each and every bubble when there's a very simple option up at the top. Now, we've had this, as I said, since 1891, and just a couple of years ago, the legislature made the decision to eliminate straight party voting, and that was challenged in court. It was challenged in court on equal protection grounds, and the judge found that eliminating this option actually violated the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, because what it would do, and there was evidence put into the record on this, and there was a lengthy trial, and the judge found that what it would do is it would increase the amount of time that voters have to wait in line to vote, and it would have a disproportionate effect in heavily minority areas, places like Detroit, like Flint, where people tend to rely on this, and there are major metropolitan areas, and so you often have a crush of people at the polls. So because it would have that sort of disproportionate racial effect, the judge struck it down, and he said it violated the Equal Protection Clause. And on the other side of it, he said there's no real reason that we need to do this, right? This has been a part of Michigan's voting system for 127 years. So it was struck down. It was the elimination of straight party voting was struck down, so it was going to remain on the ballot. And just a couple weeks ago, the Court of Appeals put that ruling on hold and held that the law eliminating straight ticket voting, I know I'm speaking on a number of different double negatives here, but the law eliminating straight ticket voting would go into effect, and so it's not going to be on the ballot this November. Now, there's litigation ongoing, there's going to be more up at the Court of Appeals stage, potentially the United States Supreme Court. It's frankly a mess, but if we pass Proposal 3, we're going to moot all of that. We're going to end the litigation, we're going to restore straight ticket voting, and it's because it's going to be in the Michigan Constitution, it's not going to be something that the legislature can take away again. So, if you vote for this proposal, you're not only restoring straight ticket voting, but you'd also be putting to a halt a lot of litigation, which will make, I'm sure, some lawyers sad, but you know, probably some of the taxpayers that are paying for it happy. And you know, this is one thing that a lot of people just sort of intuitively struggle with, I think, because you say, well, how bad is it really to go down the ballot and fill in a lot of bubbles? The reason that this matters is because in Michigan, we've had some of the longest wait times at the polls out of any state in the country. In 2016, here on the University of Michigan's campus and at Michigan State University, students were waiting in line for 3 hours to cast their ballot. Now, I mean, look, that's like inspiring. I love that students are that engaged and that they were waiting, but gosh, we should make it easier on them. We shouldn't have people that are getting out of line. And you know, the court found that straight ticket voting, eliminating it, is going to only increase the length of time that people are waiting in lines, and is going to do so in places that, like Detroit, like Flint, that are working class, and where people, frankly, don't have a lot of time to stand in line because, you know, they're losing money. There's a lot of hourly workers that are working out there. Next thing, automatic voter registration. This is a very minor change that can actually have a big impact. The way that it works now is you go to the Secretary of State, you apply for a driver's license, you're interacting with the Secretary of State in any way. You can check a box that says, I want to be registered to vote. What this would do is it would replace that box with one that says, I want to opt out of being registered to vote. So it's opt out rather than opt in. Nobody's going to be forced to vote. But the idea is, you know, we assume that most people want to be registered. They don't have to vote, of course. But we assume that most people want to be registered. It actually increases efficiency to just register everybody because, you know, you don't have to deal with additional paperwork. And by requiring somebody to check a box that says we opt out, we get people registered. We'll, you know, they still have the choice, but we'll increase the number of people that are ultimately eligible to cast a vote on election day and avoid sort of unnecessary surprise where people say, oh, you know, I thought I did that. I went to the Secretary of State's office. Didn't I automatically register to vote? Because a lot of people think that anyway.
Wait, isn't that once the Secretary of State has proof of citizenship?
Yes, but of course. So you still need to provide all the relevant documentation, but you need to do that if you're getting your driver's license anyway, right? And that's you don't have to be a citizen to get your driver's license, but you do need the Secretary of State does need to know whether you're a citizen because they can give you a different type of driver's license. Like my driver's license, if you look at it, it's got a little American flag on it, which means I'm a citizen and I can cross the border to Canada and everything like that. So they do ask for citizenship information. Obviously, if you're not a citizen, you're not eligible to vote, then this would be a moot point. I mean, you're just not going to be eligible to vote. But if you are a citizen, if you do have, if the Secretary of State does have that proof, then it would automatically register you. So that's how it works. But that's a good question. The next one, allow citizens to register anytime. This to me is one of the biggest issues. A lot of people are not super politically engaged, right? They don't start thinking about elections 30 days in advance, 60 days in advance. They really start thinking about casting a vote close to election day. And for first-time voters, that's often too late. If you move to Michigan, you decide you turn 18, you decide you want to register within 30 days of the election, you're just out of luck. You are not going to be able to cast a ballot in that election. And this disenfranchises a lot of people. You know, somebody comes to your door, the candidate comes to your door, and they say, you know, I'm running for a state representative or something. You say, great, I'd like to vote for you. If it's within 30 days of an election, you just can't. And there's really no reason for this. This is a sort of antiquated system that is a vestige of the days back when you really had to like mail in paperwork and fewer stuff was automated and you had to double check things manually, and it actually did take a lot of time to verify that you were a citizen, that you lived at your address. We don't have those problems now. And we don't have those problems now nationally, which is why 38 states and the District of Columbia provide more time to register to vote. So what Proposal 3 would do is it would say you can register to vote at any time if you do so in person, up to and including Election Day. You can register to vote by mail up to 15 days before Election Day. And what I really like about this is, sometimes people make mistakes. People make mistakes in the Secretary of State's office. Folks move around. If you show up at the polls on election day and you're trying to cast your ballot in person, and it turns out that your registration is someplace else in the state, or your registration didn't go through for whatever reason, you can just re-register then and there, that day. You're there in person, you have ID. This doesn't change anything about Michigan's ID law, and you can cast a ballot. So, to me, this is something that I mentioned, that 2.8 million number at the beginning of the presentation, 2.8 million Michiganders that didn't vote in the 2016 election. To me, this is going to bring that number down dramatically, because it really just reduces this unnecessary barrier that we place on people in terms of registering them to vote and saying you have to fill out this form 30 days ahead of time before you actually show up and participate in our democracy. No reason absentee voting. Again, this is, I think, going to be huge. What Proposal 3 would do is it would get rid of the requirement that you have to, swear an affidavit that you're either going to be absent, or you're disabled, or you're 65 years old. If you want to vote absentee before the election, and Proposal 3 passes, you can do it. You can go to the Secretary of State's office, you can go to the city clerk, you can fill out a ballot, you can turn it in. It's going to require the city clerk and Secretary of State's offices locally to remain open and to have absentee ballots on the Saturday and Sunday before the election. So if you're a working person, you work shifts on Tuesday, it's not feasible for you because you're a caregiver and you're running around with your kids to schools, you can take some time on that weekend. If it works better for your schedule, you can go in and you can exercise your franchise. This is obviously going to allow, I think, a lot of people to vote that otherwise can't. You think about working class folks, single parents, caregivers, but also it's going to make it easier for the rest of us that do show up to vote on election day. I mentioned those lines, right? We were like, I think in 2016, we had the 6th longest lines in the country in Michigan. I don't know who keeps track of this, but that's what I've been told. Now, if we've got people that are able to vote early, we're thinning out that crowd. People are going to be able to vote on their own schedule, and those of us that like to vote on election day, showing up and feeding the little thing into the tabulator and everything like that, which is me, by the way, we're going to have to wait in line less amount of time. And to me, this just makes sense. If you really take a step back and you think about it, is there any other government service where they're providing services, which is, what this is, they're providing an opportunity to vote, to 10 million people, and they're doing it all in the course of 13 hours on one day? I can't think of one. Government, I work in government. Government ain't set up to do that. So it's just, again, it's just good governance. It makes sense. If you want to wait until election day, you're more than happy to wait until election day. But if you made up your mind early, why not be able to cast your ballot just like so many people do in states around the country? And by the way, if you really look at the trend is towards early voting in most other states. The state of Oregon, for example, they do 100% mail-in ballots. Now, if you like putting the little thing in the tabulator, that might make you sad, but everybody basically votes early in Oregon. In Arizona, 75% of the voters show up at an early voting site and vote early. Florida, it's 70%. New Mexico, 70%. So this is something that's been done in a lot of other states with great success, and these are states, by the way, that have much, much, much higher rates of voter participation than does Michigan.
I'm curious, are there any states that allow online voting at all?
There are no states that allow online voting. Boy, I'll tell you, that makes me nervous. For post-election audit reasons, right? I mean, it would be so convenient. I think it would be great, but you talk to and I'm a lawyer, you talk to computer science experts and you say, like, shouldn't we be able to online vote? And you watch their faces get white. They say, so maybe someday in the future, but boy, like with hacking and everything like that, I personally wouldn't vote for this if that was part of it. And so the last thing is just to make sure that we have confidence in our elections and that the votes are being counted in a manner that reflects how they were cast. Promote the Vote Proposal 3 would require the Secretary of State after each election to conduct a mandatory audit. Again, this would basically be they would take a representative sample ballots, the paper ballots, and they would do a hand recount and make sure that the count mirrors what the tabulators spit out. And I really like this because it just depoliticizes the whole thing. If it's something that the Secretary of State just has to do after every single election, nobody can object, nobody can be accused of being a sore loser or trying to overturn the results of the election. It's just a standard thing that you do. You want to make sure that everything was on the up and up. And you want to learn for next time too, because who knows what this audit might uncover. It's just good governance to learn from past elections, to learn from what happened in the past, and to make sure that actually what we're trying to get done, which is counting all the votes fairly, was done. Again, this would not put Michigan like on the leading edge of anything. We'd just be following 32 states that already have this mandatory post-election audit procedure, and it would just increase, I think, the sense of confidence that we have in our elections and allow us to move forward. So here are some projections that people did. The Center for American Progress, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit group that looks into tough public policy problems. If we had automatic voter registration, they estimate that in Michigan, these are just in Michigan, we'd get around 97,000 more people to the polls to vote. That's just, again, that's just by changing that one question on the form from opt-out to opt-in. If we allowed people to register any time, we'd have nearly 250,000 more voters show up at the polls. And if we had no reason absentee voting, if we allowed people to vote early, we'd see an increase in about 3% in participation over time. So again, these are real numbers, these are real people. The purpose of this is to expand the electorate, to remove these barriers, and the smart people that have looked at the trends in other states and applied that to Michigan's demographics have said that we're going to see, if we pass Proposal 3, an increase in potentially hundreds of thousands of voters being able to participate in our democracy and having their voices heard here in Michigan. So this is the actual ballot language that you'll see.
You better read that, I can't read it.
Yeah, well, it's I can read it. It says, a proposal to authorize automatic and election day voter registration, no reason absentee voting, and straight ticket voting, and add current legal requirements for military and overseas voting and post-election audits to the Michigan Constitution. And it says the proposed constitutional amendment would allow a United States citizen who is qualified to vote in Michigan to become automatically registered to vote when applying for, updating, or renewing a driver's license or personal identification card, register to vote with proof of residency, and obtain a ballot during the 2-week period prior to the election, up to and including election day, obtain an absent voter ballot without providing a reason, and cast a straight ticket vote for all candidates of a particular political party when voting in a partisan general election. That's a much, much shorter version of everything that I just said, and the reason for that is because there's a requirement you have to fit a ballot proposal in 100 words. So now that you've heard the presentation, you know everything that goes behind those, sort of very vague bullet points. I understand I'm not supposed to say vote yes or no, but that's what the ballot proposal is about. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So if we go back to the driver's license thing, I
Sure.
still have mine to look at it. I don't have an American flag on mine because it's not been recently renewed.
Yeah.
But I believe I was asked, do I want an enhanced driver's license when I did it the last time? And because I have a passport, I said no. Is that still an option, or has Michigan changed it so that all driver's licenses now will identify you as a citizen?
No, so Michigan has not changed that. The enhanced driver's, so the driver's license itself does not identify you as a citizen unless you take the enhanced driver's license option. And for those of you who don't know, the enhanced driver's license allows you to go over into Canada and Mexico without presenting a passport. It's got a little chip in here. So, and that's what the American flag means. Separately, they did change the driver's licenses, I think in 2018, to comply with federal requirements. So there's it's called the Help America Vote Act, and they've got to be Real ID compliant, which is a whole statutory mess. But The short answer is no, unless you opt into the sort of border crossing option. It's not going to identify on your actual driver's license whether you're a citizen or not, but the Secretary of State does, typically have that information.
That's gonna be mandatory in 2020. Enhanced driver's license, everybody
is it?
get enhanced one in
All right,
2020. And I don't know, we were
Otherwise,
talking
it's a
about
big
this
hot
in dinner
mess.
last night. I don't know if they're gonna require that you have proof of citizenship when you go to get your license beginning in 2020 or not, but everyone is gonna be issued an enhanced driver's license beginning in 2020.
You have to, that's.
You think so?
You would think so, which means that, that's gonna require people to produce birth certificates and all. Has anybody looked at any of that to see, whether or not that's gonna be helpful for people registering?
So, the reason that everybody's going to have a particular type of license is to comply with federal law, and federal law requires, it's called the Real ID Act, and it requires certain types of underlying documentation, which can include a birth certificate, a passport, other government-issued ID to get a driver's license. And that, I think, is what's driving the change towards 2020. I'm not aware of studies as to how that might impact voter registration. It's a great question. I haven't heard of any, but you're right. It could very well be the case that you're going to see fewer people going in and getting a driver's license because it's harder to get the underlying identification, which in turn will mean that there's fewer people that are registering to vote at the Secretary of State's office. I'll just note, I think that's why, you don't have to register to vote at the Secretary of State's office. You can register to vote just by filling out a form and mailing it in. So I'll note that I think that that's actually probably yet another reason that we want to make it easier for people to register and to register at any time, because if people, aren't interacting with the Secretary of State's office as frequently, you want to provide them as many opportunities as possible to register to vote. Yep.
Thank you for the presentation on the ballot and the language as well as the impact. My question deals with the financial impact. What are the costs and/or savings that this proposal will bring if it's passed?
So I don't know that answer off the top of my head. I do know that that the prior 3 Secretary of States have endorsed this proposal and see it as really helping their efficiency. I'm trying to think what the cost centers would actually be. I should know that answer, but I don't. I don't see a lot that, other than potentially allowing no reason absentee voting and requiring city clerks to stay open Saturday and Sunday. I don't see a lot of increased cost there, and I do know that part of the reason this has been endorsed by past Secretary of States is because they think that it's actually going to increase their efficiency, in particular the opt-out, opt-in for voter registration. It makes it a lot easier on them if they're just moving everything down the line that they're dealing with and assuming that they have to register people to vote. So that's the best answer I have on that.
Okay.
So I see a lot of valid reasons why you would vote for this proposal, but those that are objecting to it, what are their grounds?
So they have various objections. With straight ticket voting in particular, the argument against the option to have straight ticket voting is, well, we want everybody to really consider each race separately and fill in the bubble for the candidate of their choice rather than just relying on party. I'm going to try to be as neutral as possible here, but there are other people that say, well, if you don't force people to vote 30 days ahead of time, you run the risk of in-person voter fraud. Somebody showing up and voting when they're not actually eligible. Again, I don't find that persuasive, and I'm trying to be factual here. In-person voter fraud is extraordinarily rare. It's already a felony. Very few people, we can't get people to vote who are eligible to do it. Few people are going to show up and cast a vote when they might wind up behind bars for 15 years. It's a very bad way of rigging an election too. I mean, you really have to get a lot of people in there. So it just really doesn't happen. And again, to me, the proof is in the pudding in what 38 other states have done, right? If this caused the sky to fall and caused massive, voter fraud problems, we would have heard about it in other states. But that is one of the counter arguments that's raised against it. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is about the absentee ballot and counting it. He was in the military, so consequently I was in the military for years.
Yeah.
We did a lot of overseas ballots and absentee balloting. And some people said, why do you even do it? They don't count them. Is that true? Or can you tell me when an absentee ballot is actually counted?
So in Michigan, and I think there are different rules for the military. The military ballots, I believe, under federal law can be postmarked by the day of the election, and they'll still count them. In Michigan, generally, if you have an absentee ballot, I believe they need to be received by election day for them to be counted. So they're usually the first ones counted. Now, military ballots and ballots overseas, I think it can still come in, up to a couple weeks after the election, depending on where you're stationed or where you're living, and those are counted. I mean, look, I don't work for the Secretary of State's office. I can't tell you that I've seen them be counted, but I have absolutely no reason to think, and I've never heard that they are not counted. It's true that you're voting in a presidential election and you postmark it on election day and you send it back in. Probably everybody's, by the time it's actually counted, probably everybody's going to know who already won the election, unless it's an extraordinarily close case, like in Florida in 2000. I remember they were waiting on military ballots to come in because there was some thought that it could actually change the outcome. But they are counted. Typically, they're counted first, and those that are postmarked later are counted as they come in.
And then my second question was about the student voting. And I was listening to NPR one day and have heard this, but they were the person being interviewed was saying that students have to, in Michigan, a student like a U of M student can't go and vote on campus. They would have to drive to their home to vote.
Yeah.
Does this affect that?
This would not directly affect that, other than the fact that you can vote early and get a no reason absentee ballot at any time, and also if you want to re-register in Ann Arbor and change your voter registration, you could do that up to election day. Though what the law says for students is that if you have a driver's license, and a lot of kids get their driver's license at the age of 16, and so it's going to be their home address. If you have a driver's license, your voter registration needs to match your driver's license, right? And you can see how that impacts a lot of students because, if you might register to vote in a campus registration drive, but you've got your driver's license from home, you're ineligible under Michigan law. This doesn't directly change that, unfortunately. That's like a separate law that would have to be addressed otherwise. But it does give students more options to change their registration up to and including on election day.
Okay. So thank you very much. Don't leave. Eli, you can take a seat.
Okay.
All right, so that was really informative. Thank you very much. And the question is, I think now, what does this have to do with Christian discipleship? Okay, is this just a political speech and political activism or not? And I would like you to turn in the handout that you have to section 3 in the handout right here. And I've asked the question, what does promoting vote have to do with Christian discipleship? And once again, when I was thinking about this, it all comes back, I think, to that great commandment that Jesus said for us to love our neighbor. This, together with the commandment to love God, is at the root of Christian discipleship. And how we treat our neighbor, view him or her or them, is very much wrapped up, I think, in Christian discipleship. And so why is this? First of all, we are all God's children. And in order to show our love of God, and in order to show our love for our neighbors, we must, as Christians, treat our neighbors with love, with respect, with fairness, and dignity. As disciples of Jesus, we must be guided in our actions and ideas by the command to love our neighbors. So to begin with, then, how we treat our neighbors, and I think that how we treat our neighbors in terms of allowing them access to the vote says an awful lot about what we think about them. And so if you turn to page 2, I've got this bullet point right here, and I ask the question, should we then say how we treat people regarding their access to the voting booth is a reflection of the respect, the dignity, and fairness and love that we have for them as Christians? I'm throwing that out there. What do you think about this? Does this matter? Does this really matter? for us as Christians is how we treat access to the voting booth. Is this a matter of Christian love and fairness? Or is it just purely political? Okay, you don't have to answer that. I just want you to think about that. Think about that. All right, so first of all, and I very much think that this is wrapped up then in issues of loving our neighbor and then showing love for God. Secondly, I very much believe that the issue of promoting the vote is an issue of social justice. And here's the question, okay, so Delph believes it's an issue of social justice. What does God think about this? And not trying to put words into God's mouth, does God care about social justice? Well, Scripture is full of examples of God's concern for social justice. Think about this. The Old Testament prophets constantly spoke about issues of social justice. The Old Testament prophets had a strong sense of social justice for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the marginalized. The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, Amos and Ezekiel all raised their voices to defend the poor and to call for greater social justice. The prophet Isaiah, writing around the year 740 BCE, proclaimed, "Ah, those who enact unjust statutes, who write oppressive decrees, depriving the needy of justice, robbing my people's poor of justice, making widows and their plunder and orphans their prey." Right? So there, the prophet Isaiah voicing God's anger at issues of social injustice. And then the prophet Amos, and this is absolutely fantastic. You all know this, of course. The prophet Amos, writing in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century, blasted the social and economic inequity of the time. He intoned, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Right? Does God care about social justice? Yes, he does very much. Very, very much. Prophets like Isaiah and Amos sharply criticized the social injustices prevalent in their societies. This is a reflection of their belief that, yes, God cares much about social justice. And in the New Testament, there are many, many, many examples of Jesus showing great concern for issues of social justice. He cared for and fed the hungry. He provided health care for those who needed it and extended comfort to those who were going through hard times. There is also clear evidence that he cared deeply for the poor, the meek, and the marginalized in society. This comes through in many places, but most especially in the Sermon on the Mount. So both the Old Testament as well as the New Testament are full of examples of God, of Jesus caring about social justice. And probably resonating very deeply with us, numerous modern-day human rights activists have been inspired by the Old Testament prophets and Jesus' ministry. A prime example, of course, is Martin Luther King. In his "I Have a Dream" speech delivered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in August of 1963, he spoke out on issues of providing the vote as very much an issue of social justice. And I've just taken some snippets from this and listened to him. It gives me goosebumps. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children. Right? This wasn't lost on him, that we are all God's children. And then he says, "But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever continue our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force." Soul force, right? We cannot be satisfied so long as the Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and the Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied and will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. That's right from Amos, right? He's taking that right from Amos. I say to you today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I would just draw your attention one more time to the ELCA website, in which quite clearly the ELCA has taken a stand on this, right? It's part of what the Senate, the local Senate, and the ELCA Church has voted to do, and that is to express their backing that voting rights it's an issue of social justice, and you can check this out at this website. And finally, promoting the vote is also a part of Christian discipleship because it is linked to political advocacy. We talked about this last week, how very much so that Luther was just up to his eyeballs in political advocacy, right? And I would draw your attention to that first bullet point right there. For the vast majority of us, we don't do that kind of stuff, right? We don't get involved in political advocacy. We're not lobbyists. But for the vast majority of us, voting during elections is a main way we engage in political advocacy. And we ought to make that then open to as many people as we possibly can. Opening up the voting process in a fair and equitable way will allow more people to become advocates for their needs and ideas. And then again, I'll give you a couple more websites, links to the ELCA website. Okay, we've got 1 minute. Final thought.
Or you can stay longer.
Yeah, you can stay longer and talk to Eli if you would like. All right, thank you very much, Eli. Oh, wait, there is a question back there. Bill, go ahead.
Is there any provision here to have a paper backup for any automated machines?
Well, we use a paper ballot now, right?
Yeah, in Michigan. I've heard talk by a county register deeds or, anyway, he said that Michigan right now has a good backup. There's no chance of it being wrong, but many states don't. And I don't know if this law is requiring that or not.
Oh, so this is just an amendment to the Michigan Constitution, so we wouldn't have jurisdiction to force other states to adopt our best practices, but I hope they do. Because you're right, I mean, most states don't have paper backups, and they have the electronic voting machines. You don't know.
But this doesn't tell us that we have to.
No. We already have paper ballots, so we do have that record already, so it doesn't change that.
All right, one more round of applause.
I might just say something about the fact that if you are interested in helping at the polls and creating shorter lines, they're still taking poll workers, and there's a training. The day is long during the day of voting, but it's a very rewarding experience. I thought it was volunteer, but they actually pay you to do it. Yeah, so if you're interested